Invade. Communists invade America and a small band of teens fight them off with guerrilla raids. This week we look at Red Dawn. The first was made in the height of the Cold War, Reagan era, and the second was made in 2012, during a time when it's been a lot harder to tell who the real enemy is. And so I think that's maybe like partially a great way to kind of, start off this discussion. There's something about the kind of the Western setting that I think really fits into, even though like this is a war movie and stuff like that, I feel like there's something about the Western setting that really makes Red Dawn what it is. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Dan.
Yeah. Hello, Dan Edmonds here, as always. For me, the original Red Dawn felt very much like a Western movie. It's kind of very much shootouts in different sort of stage set pieces all through the movie. The violence is very much has a sort of very much a us against them Western feel, or like a 1940s, 50s war movie almost. It has that kind of feel to it. But I couldn't really, I wasn't, it still isn't really clear to me as to why he made it that way. Because the bizarre thing for me is that John Milius, the guy that wrote this and pretty much put it together, it was kind of his baby, wrote Apocalypse Now, which is a completely different war movie, focused much more on the psychology and the impact of war on individuals and psychology. And this has almost no, apart from the impact it has on the teenagers in the Wolverines, doesn't really seem like it looks at warfare in a larger sense. I don't know. What was your take on it?
Yeah, I just finished watching actually a video where the person basically describes this as propaganda, and really like when he makes some really good points when I think more about it. Like, it's funny how as a teen, when I saw this movie, it didn't strike me as propaganda. I just thought, that it was a, fun action, movie that basically, of course, shows like kind of these democratic values and patriotic kind of values and stuff. But now looking back, I can definitely see how, that's really what it is a piece of propaganda for that. It justifies, throughout the movie, okay, here we have the Russians, kind of invading, so they're clearly the bad guys, and so therefore we're clearly in the right to kind of, want to fight them off and stuff. And then on top of that, when the friend, quote unquote, betrays them and stuff, then, these teens are justified in executing them and stuff, which in reality, there was no authority given to them to do that. I mean, that's what comes down to, is that it wasn't an execution even, it was just really murder, So what's funny is that but framed though in this propaganda piece though, that is Red Dawn, it was seen as oh, well, any, American fighting for his home would, can see why that would be the right thing to do and stuff. So it's interesting how framing, which is what propaganda does, is kind of bends things towards that, or skews things such that, there's the way that, you could otherwise view it. But then in this case, we're going to see it with the eyes that, the director, John Milius in the case, wants us to see it and stuff.
Yeah, it definitely has this message that if you betray America, you must die.
Yeah,
they don't make no bones about that. But going back the Western feeling though, the parallels I can draw with the Western movie is that you have the posse of Wolverines, the teenage guys living in a lawless environment. So it does have quite a few parallels. And I think, in a Western, oftentimes with the criminal gang, there's normally one who does something wrong or kind of screws up the plans of the gang. And, that is the Wild West kind of justice. Is he gets shot so he doesn't slow down the rest of it. which was kind of had exactly what I felt in that scene where they got rid of the traitor.
And that's a great point. That's one of the things that's what makes a Western movie about it. It's good to have, like, elements of the Old West, guns, of course, and horses and all that. But really, that being on the edge of lawlessness, what you just kind of pointed out, that's one of the defining, I think, elements that where the code, right, is that's what really has to reign supreme and stuff like that in a place that is so lawless and stuff. And so in this case, the code is like kind of these teens, like, deciding for themselves, like, oh, this is okay, that's not okay and stuff. And their right and wrong is like partially driven by what they were raised with and stuff. But then beyond that, now that they're on their own, this is kind of a Lord of the Flies element where, like, kind of they have to kind of decide for themselves what's right and wrong.
Yeah. And definitely, clearly, there's no gray area. Real Americans fight back.
Right.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of gunfights and a lot of shootouts in Red Dawn. So it does feel a lot like that. I mean, for me though, what I would say is so go on.
Oh, I was gonna say one last thing though is, like, there's always typically a showdown as well, and so of course towards the end, they had exactly a showdown between the brothers and like kind of this evil communist, right, and stuff.
Yeah, it was like a shootout at the OK Corral with a communist and Patrick Swayze. It was pretty surreal, actually. And that's the other weird thing. There's so many familiar faces. It's like the John Hughes insurgency movie or something. It really has a weird vibe to it. And it was very odd seeing them all in this way. I think it comes across as propaganda, but and it's right in the middle of Reagan era, Cold War, etc. But there's a part of me that kind of thinks, are we kind of selling it short a little bit as propaganda? Because I don't know if it's necessarily propaganda for the US, as versus Russia. But I mean, John Milius was an NRA member, quite a sort of flag waving one, and I wonder if this is more his take that we need to defend ourselves as Americans and uphold the Second Amendment, if should anything like this happen. And I also got this feeling that the reason he focuses on kids is, one, to hammer home the point of shocking the audience and making them afraid, because you see teenagers trying to shoot another teenager because they're a traitor. A bit like the Hunger Games. I kind of felt like that it was used in the same way in that movie to just add shock value. But also as a way to just sort of say, okay, we've had one generation that's gone through war. This generation in the 80s, they've had it too easy. They don't know what war's like to go through, to experience. So, I need to make something that makes the people aware of what you need to sacrifice, what you would have to encounter psychologically if you were in a war scenario.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, though. Also, I have to admit that, like, coming from that generation, I did, have that sense of that, like, what did we really know about sacrifice, right? Like you said, it was a generation that pretty much had it easy. Granted, we had this kind of fear of, like, kind of, the nuclear holocaust and stuff like that, but it was a fear. It wasn't like we're, unlike the 60s, that, like, there was no draft, and, like, there was no chance that, like, any of us were going to actually be in a war. But of course, what do? I actually end up joining the military, just to, and that's one of the things that
John Milius's job is done there, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's face it, like, kind of, for better or for worse, I bought into the whole, like, kind of Uncle Ronnie's message of, like, kind of, we need to fight the evil empire and stuff, and that's I bought into it, like, kind of, like, we're I think that's the thing that like it's interesting how, um, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why I see this now as like kind of more propaganda stuff is because like looking back at how much like I started off before the 80s, with this view that like, oh, I'd never, join the military, I'd never go to war, all that kind of stuff. But by the end of the 80s, like I'm running alongside the Marines chanting about napalming babies and stuff. And, like kind of just waking up one day, like on one of those kind of marches and stuff and going, whoa, when did this happen? How did I get here and stuff like that? And then now I'm realizing, of course, that that's partially, why. It's like kind of it was propaganda that totally sucked me in, like made me believe that, like, that we had this kind of duty to kind of, carry on, like kind of the banners of democracy, to kind of be ready to fight, fight off the communists and stuff. And, I joke about this sometimes too, with having clients who are, like kind of what would have been behind the Iron Curtain. Like, I talk with these folks almost every other day and everything, like folks from Russia, Poland and all that. And like, if it was like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that never would have happened. Like kind of, so it's funny how, we've I wouldn't even say one full circle, but we kind of like came back to this place though, that like we realize how much the media can be used as a tool for influence and stuff. And
absolutely.
We just it can a lot of times happen before we even recognize it and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I bought into the media thing that English people are intelligent. They're always like super intelligent criminals, and then Brexit happens and make us all look like idiots. It's when my worldview has been totally shattered.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to like the documentaries or the things behind the whole Brexit thing, because it's still like kind of I'm still befuddled by how that all happened.
Yeah, I think everyone's still trying to unpack it, to be honest with you, years after it's happened.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, one thing I did, the weird thing for me with this movie is that if you took it almost in snapshots and you made a trailer from it with like the most violent bits and some of the interactions of the teenagers, it would almost play like a Robert Rodriguez Tarantino kind of parody trailer for a movie that was made in the 80s. It's so over the top in some ways, but in other ways it's really kind of realistic, or not. Well, I mean, I would say the teenagers' journeys through being, scared school kids to actual kind of a guerrilla warfare unit is done with quite a lot of authenticity, and it's really quite compelling watching their journey. But the whole premise of the rest of the movie is pretty ludicrous. I mean, it's like almost absurd, especially now when you're looking at it. I mean, I don't think it got much. I don't remember even seeing that movie in England in the 80s. It may have just been cinemas in England just thought, yeah, this is kind of some ridiculous American movie. I mean, it probably did play, but it's not something that was on my radar at all, because it was probably so kind of pro-American. But I do find that kind of interesting that he took such a extreme scenario of like Russians parachuting into Colorado, but then did this kind of, quite sort of realistic take on how those characters would behave and react, and how he would become a chaotic insurgency force in the country. Yeah,
I think that's the thing, that the tactics and all that kind of stuff, the training was really thought out. The plot and the kind of, overall like premise and stuff like that, it's kind of, I think there was a lot of like, pushing the I believe button, like kind of where basically, suspending belief of like, the Russians and Cubans would kind of, invade together, and, and just overcoming a lot of like kind of things that like, probably if it was like a Tom Clancy writer, I think it would have been laid out in a lot more realistic way and stuff. I mean, clearly I don't think he ever even like, asked somebody like a Tom Clancy who, is somebody that like that does their research, does the kind of like realistic scenarios and stuff, talks to like people from the the Naval War College and all that kind of stuff, and like that's not John Milius in this case. I think he just
No.
he just basically just kind of went with his ideas of how it would happen and stuff, and that was good enough for him, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, what is it kind of like a Magnificent Seven kind of model or something? It's kind of, I don't know, that's what it sort of feels like in terms of structure.
Definitely. And he admits it too, that like he basically took a lot from, the John Ford movies and everything. And I mean, you see it like kind of just the overall feel of things, the whole riding off into the, into the sunset kind of thing with the teens and stuff. And like even time, like, visiting the farms of, there was this, I guess, couple that like they frequented different times for supplies, whatever, and stuff. And so it just had that kind of feeling that like, they were headed to the hills and then like, ride into, town occasionally and stuff. And
yeah, the posse rides into town and causes trouble and rides out again.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading that John Milius apparently was, he was supposed to go to Vietnam and then didn't. He got for some reason, and he felt like he really missed out. And I feel like Red Dawn, and possibly even to some extent Apocalypse Now, I suppose, are almost him creating the war that he never got to experience. And whereas Apocalypse Now is like a very dark and shows the worst sides of it, you almost feel like he kind of went on a fantasy heroic kind of thing with Red Dawn and tried to sort of create something that he couldn't have experienced himself in some way. Yeah,
because when you look at like kind of, if you look at Apocalypse Now as a reflection of his views on war and stuff like that, on the one hand, you have like the kind of like I said, the darker image and stuff like that, like literally kind of taking from the heart of darkness, and then on the other, you also have Kilgore, who is this Colonel Kilgore, who is this character, right, that Robert Duvall plays, that basically, glorifies war, and all of the men like kind of, worship him for it and stuff. And I think that's the kind of thing that like where, like kind of there's this kind of duality there that, it's just like, I think a clue as to where, we are with Red Dawn, that like then at this point then in his worldview, war is justified when it's for your country, right, and stuff. It's maybe like kind of questionable if it's like some foreign soil and you're bleeding for people who why are you there, kind of there and stuff like that. But if it's on your home turf, then it's absolutely justified, like kind of in John Milius's kind of view, which kind of again blends into him being a member, NRA member and stuff like that, which is about defending, every citizen has the right to defend their home and stuff. And if somebody comes to the door, then by God, like kind of I'm gonna have my gun and ready to kind of shoot him and stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. Obviously his view, against us going and fighting a battle somewhere else or on home turf is very different. Obviously, everything is justified on home turf.
Yeah.
And I suppose when you look at Marlon Brando's character in Apocalypse Now, he's the one who's kind of going against the orders, really, of what's being set out. So
right.
It's funny because you look at Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now as kind of like almost like a kind of parody, ironic character. When you're watching it, you kind of think, this is the filmmaker's clever, ironic take on military life. But actually, after watching Red Dawn, you realize this is him. This is probably, he's thinking, this is how we should be running the war. It's like Kilgore to some degree.
Right.
Maybe
Which, I want to say that there's some point that, like, if Kilgore doesn't actually say it, you felt like he said it, that like, like, this is how we should be fighting it and be over then and stuff, like kind of like, like that's how we screwed up, was because we didn't fight it, like a real war, like that kind of idea. And there were absolutely people who saw Vietnam that way, like kind of that it would have been over if we were able, and, there is some truth to it, because there's a lot of weird rules of engagement, a lot of like kind of, okay, you can bomb here on this day, on that, kind of, and so like we're basically almost advertised like kind of, how it was going to happen and stuff. So gee, oh, by the way, then, like the forces, like, like the enemy, got wind of it and kind of made sure they cleared the area, when you kind of like basically had it laid out that way and stuff. And so, yeah,
it's a very strange approach.
Definitely.
And it almost it pushes your enemy into a position where they have to use civilian locations to defend them, well, to survive and to then fight back from.
And that's in effect what's funny is even in Red Dawn they actually mentioned it a couple times though about I want to say like it was one of the colonels or officers in Red Dawn that talked about how like kind of I saw this in like kind of Afghanistan, I saw this in Vietnam, and basically this idea that like when you piss off like kind of and let the people kind of run amok and stuff like that, it just gets out of hand and stuff like that. So it kind of is again another like kind of glimpse into Milius's worldview about like kind of that when you don't fight a war, like kind of no holds barred and stuff like that, you kind of allow like kind of the people to kind of get stirred up and to kind of fight rebellions, and then next thing you know you lose control and everything. So
yeah, and I mean in the remake, Chris Hemsworth is there right at the beginning saying,
right.
I was there in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now we've got to make chaos in our own country.
Right.
So he did it very explicitly in that one.
And I think what's interesting is how like rather than seeing like kind of this view of like kind of kids like kind of really trying to figure things out and all that, like here in theory Chris Hemsworth is this kind of trained Marine that like then can quickly train these guys like to be like an elite kind of force and all that, and that's just not realistic. I mean like I've seen like kind of like kind of different types of military training in different levels of stuff, and like what he proposed is like kind of, or what is proposed in Red Dawn 2012 is just not like I mean the granted the actors did go through boot camp again here, and then it did make them look sharp and stuff like that, but anybody who like has any kind of real military training will tell you that like you're lucky if like you get people to the point that like they are able to point weapons in the right direction and not shoot each other and stuff.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Anybody who like has any kind of real military training will tell you that like you're lucky if like you get people to the point that like they are able to point weapons in the right direction and not shoot each other and stuff.
Yeah, I can well imagine. Yeah, I mean, and that's, I suppose, as quirky and misguided as Red Dawn in the 80s was, it's even more bizarre in the 2012 version, where apparently when they first wrote it, it was China as the aggressor, and then they changed it to North Korea, which becomes even less likely than China.
Here we have a country that like is barely able to feed its own population and stuff, and then now all of a sudden they have the forces to invade like kind of one of the largest superpowers. It just I talk about stretching imagination or suspending disbelief and stuff. Like I don't know what the writers were thinking in this case to like to make it North Korea and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean even in, if you wanted to sort of recreate just the story of the teenagers going from school kids to a guerrilla force, there wasn't really much of that in the 2012 version. Like you said, it was just Chris Hemsworth telling people what to do, and within about 15 minutes they seemed to have pretty much everything locked down. Blowing up tanks and everything. It was just like, wow, just let the football team loose and they'll win the war for you. It just made no sense really at all. The explosions were bigger. The gunfights were noisier and better choreographed. But there was also some quite ludicrous product placement in that they duck into a subway and the guy even lists things on the menu to them, which I thought was, and of course I think there's one for Call of Duty Modern Warfare as well thrown in.
And in the original one, you had at least a sense of like a slight desperation to where, you know, like kind of the not only the teens but the people were kind of like, they look, you know, things look a little bit more run down. People, you know, which kind of makes sense. And like, you know, like that here is a town under siege and stuff like that, and the military is going to take care of themselves. But you know, other than that, then who is going to basically supply a town, right? And stuff. But apparently, in 2012, Subway was still running its franchises and making sure that you know, like kind of everyone could get their 6-inch to foot-long sandwiches, I guess.
Absolutely. You know, Subway's distribution, their supply management is it's invasion proof.
Yes.
You know? Can't say better than that, can you? Yeah. I mean, I can't remember because, to be honest with you, about halfway through, I really switched off with the 2012 version. But what I kind of liked with the original was at least that, you know, various members of the Wolverines died as the story went on. So it kind of whittled them down, and you got this kind of, there was this kind of desperation. But this one, it felt like, apart from like Chris Hemsworth died, right? And that was about it.
And I think that's one of the you know, it goes back to our discussions different times about, you know, what is the big problem with remakes and stuff. And to me, one of the biggest problems that we've seen throughout these different ones is that, like, with the bigger budgets, the nicer CGI, and, you know, like kind of special effects and all that kind of stuff, is that like there's this kind of slick MTV kind of feel to things and stuff, and it really loses, you know, like kind of the heart, like kind of, you know, like, I granted, you know, I absolutely understand like kind of making things look more polished and stuff. But when you do it to the point that, like, you know, you have a Subway store, you know, for product placement, you you know, have like all the characters all look like they should be on, you know, like kind of some episode of Spring Break, you know, like kind of, you know, MTV Spring Break kind of episode stuff. It just kind of, it just loses something, you know, like kind of, whereas, you know, in the original one, you saw like kind of the people like kind of, you know, there's this lack of makeup for the girls, and, you know, the guys like, you know, different times like are wearing kind of things with like, you know, a little bit raggy and stuff like that. And that kind of just went away. Like kind of, you know, like all of a sudden, like, you know, we have leather jackets, you know, in 2012 and, you know, on and on.
Red Dawn brought to you by Abercrombie and Fitch. It's just, I mean, the other thing is what they often do with, I found with modern remakes, and this is across practically all genres, is that if there's a hard moral choice or something that's, you know, brutal for the sake of making a point in the story of why something is particularly wrong, they soften it. Like in this one, you know, they don't kill off as many of the Wolverines. And also,
there isn't the betrayal element.
No,
they took that away.
They geotagged him, so it's not really his fault. So they didn't have to make that hard choice of whether to let him live or die. And there's a lot of that you see in remakes. Lack of edge.
Yeah, I mean that was like kind of just one of the things that to me was a great element in the original, was like kind of the fact that like it was a tough decision. It was one that, like, you know, it had more impact then because of that. And, you know, here, like, you know, if they killed the kid, it you know, wouldn't have mattered much and stuff. I mean, you know, would have been kind of, you know, like, if anything, just, you know, even more wrong and stuff. But in this case, you know, like, they let him go, like, kind of, you know, which is like kind of like, okay, like, oh, that's kind of bad, and that, you know, they had to let somebody go and stuff, right? And but yet, you know, like kind of even that wasn't as bad because of the fact that, like, it wasn't because of a betrayal and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, there was no actual. I mean, they kind of played it as the sacrifice in that he has to sort of give himself up to the enemy forces, but it still doesn't have the punch of the betrayal and having to make that hard choice. So.
And I think, you know, along with that, like kind of on the opposite end, is that they had to make a romance between the one sister and, you know, the lead character. You know, like kind of like,
God, yeah.
Like that was something that, like, you know, they totally just avoided doing in the original, and I felt like that actually worked better because like it was like the distraction to kind of have that stuff in 2012.
Well, I'm going to have to just, I mean, for me, that was just, it just completely threw me. I mean, I was already not really paying attention to the movie,
Right.
and that just, you know, that had me reaching for my phone or something else. Yeah, it seemed completely ridiculous. They're reminiscing about old, I mean, maybe that is more realistic. I don't know. It didn't work for me. I couldn't say that much, you know.
I think
Chris
overall,
Hemsworth on this, yeah.
I think overall though, I think what the 2012 does do, like without like intentionally doing it well, is that it reflects though how it's not as clear a menace or a you know a quote unquote enemy and stuff. Like in 1984, you know, yeah, we kind of excuse me, we kind of joked that you know it was Russia as the evil empire and stuff, but it was the Cold War. It was like it was a very us versus them kind of, you know, at least for the U.S.'s geopolitical kind of thing and stuff like that. Is this idea that like you know the real threat to if anybody was a real threat to the U.S. it was Russia. Now and you know 2012 and actually of course even like you know today and stuff like that. You have like you know is the threat you know some terrorists, you know, like kind of from the Mideast? Is it, you know, like kind of North Korea and stuff like that? And granted, you know, like it's not likely that North Korea is going to be invading the U.S. and stuff like that. But there's other things that they could do. You know, they apparently do have, you know, nuclear weapons. They do have, you know, dirty bombs and you know, like things that they can really, you know, do to wreak havoc and stuff. And you know, the thing there is like kind of in the modern setting, it's not as clear cut who your threat is and stuff. Like if you were a national security advisor, you know, needing to kind of, you know, advise the president as to what is the real threat and stuff like that. You know, of course the joke is that like, you know, it's apparently Mexico, so let's put up a big wall and everything. But the reality is that like, you know, we don't really have the ability to kind of really isolate, you know, who is a real threat to our country and stuff or to our national security because it just could be coming from any direction.
Yeah. But then there's also the question of, you know, is the threat to a particular country's power or status or standing in the world really based on a military invasion or incursion these days? It's more likely that, you know, some other country will just find a new way of robotically producing products much more efficiently and just sort of have a major impact on the economy that will just sort of impoverish people rather than an actual military incursion. That seems to be far more likely in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean,
just
let's
be
face
economic factors.
That's really what China's done. I mean, you know, like kind of they're winning the trade war, right? Where you know, like they now are like kind of you know we've seen like not only the rise of their economy and stuff, but you know if after a while the trade deficit is such that you know here you have this country that like you know now you owe them you know like kind of more and more then you know their invasion then is to buy up you know like kind of you know your real estate and then you know become your landlord and then you know like it doesn't have to take you know even one shot be fired. It's just basically all for it with you know dollar signs, right?
Yeah, and also there's the question of, because I mean, considering this was, I tried to view it as China invading, just to maybe make it a little bit more plausible. So whenever they showed I just trying to imagine that being China
right
rather than the Korea one, as that was the author's original intent.
Right.
But then I still thought, you know, why would you go, if you're in China,
right.
why would you go to the trouble of invading America?
Right.
It'd be just far easier to invade Russia if you badly needed land and resources. You know, you're right on the doorstep.
Yeah.
And not too many people are going to put up a fight against that either, I'm guessing. It's, you know, if NATO has collapsed, like as in their scenario.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know. But the other thing I thought is maybe a point that is worth considering with the original. If we take it that the premise is so ludicrous that this is actually perhaps more, and you're taking it from the perspective he's a real gun-toting NRA member. Maybe he's actually more making a statement on what a potential civil war, how that might play out, if that ever came to be. Maybe if you view it as more actually what could potentially happen between, two forces within the states, then it immediately becomes, much more interesting scenario, I think. Not that I think is terribly likely either, but, I wonder if I'm trying to give him credit, but something interesting. But yeah, there's another sort of interesting point of how you can look at it, maybe.
I think also that definitely makes it a very different movie then, because at the heart of all this is the idea of that we as Americans are, going to do anything it takes to kind of defend our homeland, and even if it's like a bunch of teens, just basically cobbling together whatever weapons they can kind of gather or steal and stuff. And I think it's like kind of when it becomes like, let's say that like you said, it was like people who have been like the homesteaders, or like kind of like suddenly wanting to kind of fight back the government from kind of taking over, like kind of the right to bear arms and stuff like that. It just becomes a thing of like, but it's an interesting scenario though, like kind of certainly the idea of Americans fighting Americans on their own soil and stuff like that. But again, it just kind of then it changes the dynamics of like kind of from defending your home to fighting each other, like kind of.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But certainly that could be I don't know. It wouldn't be Red Dawn, of course, but it could be an interesting kind of movie though, about like kind of the next Civil War and stuff like that. That's something I think it'd be interesting if anybody does explore that, stories like that. And the scale of it though would be like absolutely like kind of I don't know if any studio would be willing to kind of back that up, I guess.
I mean, if they're not willing to sign on, they're scared of losing, the Chinese audience with the 2012 version. Then there's pretty 0% chance it's going to happen with a civil war. I mean, that goes back to as well this idea of how intertwined China is with the US economically. And how,
that's a great point.
Hollywood studios pander to, or maybe not pander, but they take into account the Chinese audiences and don't want to sort of upset that market, as is illustrated very well in the latest season of South Park.
Right.
If you ever get a chance to see that episode, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's just ultimately another huge factor nowadays for Hollywood, is that like they have to take that into account, because a lot of the different movies, even if they do just okay domestically, the next big movie audience is China, like that's and so that has to be factored into like is this movie going to succeed or not and stuff. So and that's I think we've passed this threshold now, being where at one point it didn't matter as much, but nowadays it's just absolutely has to be taken into account.
Totally. Rise of Skywalker, please take note. Judging by their box office figures. Yeah. So I don't know if you had any more insights on either the remake or the original with Red Dawn.
I think one other thing that like is something that is a interesting dynamic is just the brothers, and in the original I felt like it was actually less clear why there was this kind of tension between them, because they seemed like kind of, like if anything, they just kind of got along and stuff like that. So there was really no, nothing that really indicated, like kind of a conflict and everything, even though like it was maybe mentioned here and there. And then like in the 2012 though, it felt like they kind of spelled it out a lot more. And then like one thing that kind of did make it a little bit more of a story though was the fact that like it starts off in the football game, and Maddie is seen as this kind of individualist, right, where he and so that's kind of where a little bit of the kind of propaganda, I guess, comes into 2012. We're like,
Yeah.
it's about like kind of, you got to be a team player and stuff.
Yes, exactly.
And otherwise, like, you're going to basically cause people to die, right? So.
Yeah, because he breaks from the team to save his girlfriend, and it's for someone dies as a result. So yeah.
So I mean, on the one hand, it was like kind of there was a point to all that, but the other, it felt a little kind of almost too spelled out and too like kind of contrived, I guess, and stuff like that. So so.
As is another trend with a lot of remakes, they're always the messages are often far too explicit and contrived a lot of the time. Yeah.
So that's probably the other thing that I'd say that like really stood out for me as to the different ideas. As to whether I don't know, I have a feeling like, of course, down the road we'll see another remake of Red Dawn, and then it'll be interesting to see what that'll look like, I guess. I don't imagine that like it'll be any easier to kind of have a clear-cut enemy and stuff like that. Although a Red Dawn with like a alien invasion, I guess, could be an interesting. But then again, would that be the same kind of movie then, or is it like at that point does it just become really aliens then, or something like that? Or for that matter, Independence Day, right? So.
Well, I mean, I think we've mentioned it before. I think the reason science fiction and aliens became the bad guys increasingly from the 50s onward is because war movies, we already had such a bad war that everyone was aware of, that we needed a new enemy, and aliens were like the stand-in. So that's why you don't get very many war movies.
Right.
I'm even trying to think, aside from ones that try and sort of take a very kind of balanced view of both sides, it's definitely not the kind of propaganda style war movies that you got earlier. So aliens have been the stand-in. They've been the bad guy for a long time now, because it can't be seen to be making war with people who could be trade partners. So
yeah, and then I guess after a while, aliens kind of lost some of their attractions like that. So then we had to switch to zombies. So
yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and I think aliens have kind of been a stand-in for. On the more kind of utopian views of alien civilizations, has sort of been our stand-in for religion as well. I think we've replaced a lot of our sort of religious ideals with, Vulcans or people who've got like a perfect understanding of logic over emotion and things like this.
Right.
They've been the stand-in, I think.
Alrighty. So coming up next, we're going to be looking at Death Wish. We've had the theme of revenge in a few different past episodes now, and then I think this will be definitely another one to revisit that idea.
Yeah, I was also wondering, in terms of Death Wish, there was a movie with Mel Gibson where he avenges the death of his daughter.
Oh, right.
I can't remember the name of it now.
Was it Payback?
But I can't remember. I'll have to. I think it was something else. But I might revisit that, just because I think there's this part of my brain that's telling me this is going to be very similar in structure to Death Wish, and it might almost be like an unofficial remake in some respects. So
right.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see if there's a few others like that.
Definitely. Awesome. So once again, I'm John Chang, and this is Dan Edmonds. Thanks for watching.
Goodbye, I should say. Yeah.
And as always, be sure to like and subscribe.